This is Mr. Beck Does Your Homework. This is AP Physics Homework 2.3. These are questions number 4 and 5. It's a two-part question. Question number 4 says, a driver of a car traveling at 15.7 meters per second applies the brakes, causing uniform deceleration of 1.6 meters per second squared. Let me pull out some of those numbers. The car is traveling at 15.7 meters per second. So that is my initial velocity is 15.7 meters per second. That's what it's doing right now. The car applies the brakes, causing a uniform deceleration of 1.6 meters per second. So I know that my acceleration, meters per second squared, my acceleration is going to be 1.6 meters per second squared. But wait a second, this says deceleration. This says he applies the brakes. Now what I have here is a car going in this direction, and then I'm applying the brakes. So what's happening is my acceleration is actually in this direction is my acceleration. So my acceleration is backwards compared to the direction the car is going. So if I say that the right is positive, then to the left would be negative. So I have to be careful of something like this, where my acceleration in this case is going to be negative. I'm going to have to keep track of it. So my acceleration is negative 1.6 meters per second squared. How long does it take? Well, that's time. Time is going to be question mark. How long does it take the car to accelerate to a final speed of 13.5 meters per second? So my final velocity is going to be 13.5 meters per second. Now that's kind of funny because it says accelerate, and this is 13.5 as a final, and I start at 15.7, so I can see that I'm slowing down. If you miss this negative, what you're going to wind up with is a negative amount of time. So you'll know something's up when time is negative, because that doesn't happen too often in physics. So answer in units of seconds. So let's solve for time. I have an initial velocity, a final velocity, an acceleration. I'm looking for time. What I don't know and what I don't care about is my displacement. The equation I have that relates these four variables without displacement is that my final velocity equals my initial velocity plus my acceleration times time. My final velocity is 15.7 meters per second equals my initial, I got that backwards, see? Even Mr. Beck can make a mistake. My final velocity is 13.5 meters per second equals my initial velocity of 15.7 meters per second plus my acceleration of negative 1.6 times my time. So now I'd have 13.5 minus 15.7 to move that over the other side. And notice that's going to give me a negative number, equals negative 1.6 times time. So when I divide this by the negative number, divide both sides by negative 1.6, this is going to wind up being a positive number as this cancels out. So negative negative cancels out. I'll get time being a negative on top and a negative on the bottom. So now I'm going to know that my time equals whatever this is. Question 5 now asks, how far has the car moved during the braking period? How far has the car moved? That is looking for x equals question mark. How far has the car moved? Now I know my initial velocity, my acceleration, my final velocity. I now also know my time, but for kicks, I'm going to look for the equation that doesn't have time and relates initial velocity, final velocity, acceleration, and displacement. You could use any equation that has displacement in it to try to get the right answer here, and you might do one or two of them just to make sure you get the right answer if it were on a test or something. So I'm going to use the equation that doesn't have time, and the equation that doesn't have time tells me that my final velocity squared equals my initial velocity squared plus twice my acceleration times my displacement. So my final velocity squared, that's going to be 13.5 squared equals my initial velocity squared, 15.7 squared, plus twice my negative 1.6 times my displacement. Now you'll see that this number is going to be smaller than that number, so when I subtract that, this side will wind up negative. So if I had 13.5 squared minus 15.7 squared, that's going to be negative, equals 2 times negative 1.6 times x. But when I divide it by the negative, you'll see that I will have a positive displacement. So that'll give me my answer for my displacement.